Hey, history lovers, get ready for a deep dive into the forgotten law that literally mapped America. We're unraveling the epic tale of the grid that ate America. Back in 1785, a broke young government passed the Land Ordinance, establishing a mathematical tyranny, a grid of perfect mile-square sections that eventually devoured 75% of the continental U.S. This wasn't just surveying, it was a total revolution that prioritized geometry over nature. We follow the first surveyors as they impose the straight line, witness the devastating water wars it sparked in the arid West, and explore how this invisible, uniform pattern became a scar only truly visible from the air. From perfectly square farms to monolithic urban planning, this is the story of how the grid shaped the American mind and its identity. Finally, we witness the modern-day fight to break the grid's pattern and let the rivers and communities curve once more. Don't miss this incredible hidden history. Hit that like button, subscribe for more untold stories, and tell us in the comments what you think about this historical act of geographical engineering. The right angle is not a natural shape. It is an imported tyranny, a mathematical imposition born not of the gentle curves of rivers or the chaotic scatter of mountains, but of the cold, hard logic of Enlightenment men obsessed with order. It is the signature of a conqueror who does not simply claim the land, but redefines it. For 2 centuries before the grid came, America was a place of organic growth. Settlements hugged the coast, following the contours of bays and estuaries. Property lines were defined by memory and landmark, from the old oak to the large rock, and then following the stream. It was messy, human, and rooted in the land's actual physical reality. A farmer might own a narrow strip of rich river-bottom soil or a triangular wedge of forest, its shape dictated by drainage and deed. Then came the year 1785, and a desperate, fledgling government with a vast, unexplored territory stretching west. They needed to sell the land, to populate it, and to fund a broke nation. To sell it quickly, they had to simplify the infinite complexity of the continent. They needed a tool not for description, but for abstraction. That tool was the Land Ordinance of 1785, the forgotten law. It was not signed by a celebrity president, nor was it heralded by great debate. It was an act of quiet, radical engineering, passed by the Congress of the Confederation, a body so weak it was soon replaced. Yet its impact would dwarf any clause in the subsequent Constitution. This single, unassuming law declared that the American West would not be a quilt of individual organic claims. It would be a plat, a massive, uniform checkerboard laid down with the ruthless precision of a military campaign. The grid. The law decreed that the land be divided into townships, each 6 miles square. These townships were then subdivided into 36 sections, each 1 mile square, 640 acres. No matter the mountain range, the canyon, or the meander of the great Mississippi, the lines of latitude and longitude, the instruments of the cartographer would take precedence. The compass and the chain, held by the federal surveyor, would become the true rulers of the West. The Surveyor's Creed. Elias Thorne was one such surveyor, a former Continental Army officer who traded his musket for a Gunter's chain. In 1803, standing on the eastern edge of the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase, he looked west. The landscape before him, a riot of virgin forest and rolling unmarked prairie, felt infinite and utterly indifferent to his task. This, his superior, a stern, spectacled man named Mr. Harrington, had told him, is the highest act of civilization, Thorne. Not building a city, but preparing the ground for one. We are establishing the geometry of opportunity. Elias carried with him 2 documents, a small, leather-bound copy of the ordinance and a brass compass. The compass was not merely a tool for finding north, it was an instrument for imposing it. His job was to walk the true north-south and east-west lines, slashing them through the wilderness, planting hardwood stakes every half-mile, and carving notches into bearing trees. The work was brutal. In the swamps of Ohio, the lines dissolved into muck, the chain rusting as quickly as he pulled it. In the high plains, the fierce sun buckled his instruments. The grid demanded straight lines, yet the earth offered none. Elias and his team wrestled the line through thickets, over streams, and up cliffs. "Why not just follow the ridge, Elias?" His chainman, a rough-hewn Kentuckian named Jedediah, grumbled one afternoon as they hacked through a wall of impenetrable briar. "It's a sight easier walking." Elias wiped sweat and blood from his brow. "Because, Jedediah, the ridge belongs to God. This line," he kicked a newly planted stake, "belongs to the Republic. The grid is perfect. The earth is flawed. We are here to fix the flaw." That was the creed. The grid was a moral principle. It represented equality. Every section was equal to the next, regardless of its immediate features. It represented speed. Land could be described, bought, and sold sight unseen by simply quoting a number. The northwest quarter of Section 16, Township 4 North, Range 7 West. It was the ultimate engine of commodification. The consequences of this mathematical dogma began subtly, then accelerated into a cultural transformation. The grid didn't just divide the land, it divided the mind. The unseen scar. The first true casualty was the Native American relationship with the land. Their understanding was topographical, mythological, and based on use. Boundaries were porous, defined by hunting grounds and seasonal migration paths. The grid was an abstract language they couldn't speak. When a government agent tried to explain to a Lakota elder that his village and ancestral burial ground now sat neatly within Section 24, the elder simply pointed to the sky. "The land does not owe a section," he said. "The land knows the moon and the river. Your lines are invisible to the buffalo." But the lines were not invisible to the settler who arrived shortly thereafter, armed with a title deed stamped with the section number. The grid was the legal, moral, and military justification for eviction. The geometry of the survey became the geometry of displacement. As the years marched on, the grid became the skeleton of the American map. Towns were not built in organic clusters, they were platted on the section corners, resulting in the iconic Four Corners intersection and the perfectly square courthouse lawn. Roads did not wind to avoid hills, they ran straight along the mile-long section lines, becoming long, desolate, monotonous ribbons of asphalt. In the vast, open squares of the Great Plains, the grid reached its apotheosis. Farmers plowed their fields in perfect, huge squares, ignoring the terraformed advice of the wind and rain. The lines were so straight, so true, that they became a visible scar on the earth. A pattern so immense it is only truly visible from the air, or later, from the nascent satellite images. 75% of the continental U.S. carved into the same rigid boxes. The grid didn't just shape the fields, it shaped the American character.
It instilled a faith in rationality, in scale, and in the idea that nature must be tamed by calculation. It made it easy to become rich quickly by buying and selling numbered plots, fostering a volatile, speculative market that would define the American boom and bust cycle. It created a world of immense geographical clarity, but cultural uniformity. But a grid, by its nature, resists deviation, and history, like nature, always finds a way to curve.
The year was 1841. The grid was no longer a theoretical line drawn on a dusty parchment in Washington, D.C. It was a physical fact, stamped onto the rich, dark soil of Illinois. To the settlers pouring westward, the system of townships and sections wasn't a tyranny. It was a promise. It meant that land title was clear, easy to locate, and backed by the federal government. A revolutionary improvement over the confusing, contested deeds of the East. Elias Thorne, the surveyor from Chapter 1, was long gone, his stakes now weathered and half buried, but his geometry lived on. The Harrison Claim. Elias Harrison stood on the northeast corner of Section 10, Township 5 North, Range 3 East. He squinted, trying to reconcile the infinite sweep of the tall prairie grass with the geometric certainty of his deed. His wife, Martha, held their 3-year-old daughter, Eliza, whose wide eyes were already accustomed to the endless straight horizon. "It's ours, Martha," Elias breathed, his voice thick with awe and exhaustion. "Where exactly are the boundaries, Elias? All I see is grass that swallows a man whole." Elias smiled, tapping the pocket where his deed lay. "The boundaries are where the law says they are. We run a straight line south, 1 mile to the corner post, and a straight line west, 1 mile to the next. The lines don't follow the rise and fall of the ground, they ignore it. We can walk those lines by sighting on the corner stakes and driving our own." The grid simplified everything. Land was divided equally, regardless of the quality of the soil or the presence of timber. This equality, however, was also its deepest inequity. Elias was lucky. His section was mostly level and dry. His neighbor to the west, however, Section 9, had a deep, marshy slough cutting across a quarter of his claim, but he paid the same price and held the same sized square. The grid gave people equal parts, but not equal value. The Social Blueprint, Section 16. The most consequential feature of the Land Ordinance was the designation of Section 16 in every single township. The law stipulated that the revenue derived from the sale or lease of Section 16 was to be used exclusively for the maintenance of public schools. It was the first widespread federal investment in universal education. "We need a schoolhouse, Elias," Martha stated, already focused on a future beyond the initial log cabin. "Our daughter won't grow up unlettered." The Harrison family Section 10 bordered Section 16 directly to the south. This wasn't by chance, it was by design. The grid didn't just structure land ownership, it structured society. The ideal location for the schoolhouse, they knew, would be near the center of the township, maximizing the distance for all children. This spot was almost always the corner where Sections 15, 16, 21, and 22 met, the geographical heart of the community. In this ordered, predictable landscape, where the school was not a matter of debate, it was a matter of mathematics. The Harrison family began their days with the back-breaking task of breaking the prairie sod. The work was endless, but the geometry gave them a focus. They plowed straight lines, parallel to the surveyor's true north-south boundary. Every fence post, every row of corn was aligned to the grid. The resulting landscape was a mosaic of right angles, an agricultural machine designed for efficiency. The problem of the curve.
As the settlement grew, the people adapted to the rigidity of the grid, but the land did not. One year, a terrible storm rolled in from the northwest. The rainwater, unable to follow the natural winding swales and depressions that drained the land historically, was trapped by the straight-line plowing and fencing that followed the section lines. The water pooled massively on the lower half of Elias's Section 10, destroying his early spring wheat. It was a problem that had never existed when the land was untamed prairie, but the new, rigid boundaries had fundamentally altered the flow of nature. "The water needs to go to the creek, Elias," Martha pointed out, looking at the standing water. "But Mr. Miller's fence follows that section line exactly, and it acts like a dam." "He has a right to fence his line," Elias sighed, frustration warring with the reverence he had for the law. "It's his northwest quarter of Section 15. The law guarantees his boundary." "The law guaranteed his boundary, but it didn't guarantee our harvest. The old-timers in the east followed the creek beds when they set their property lines. They built with the land, not against it." The grid, the great equalizer, had created a new form of conflict, not over who owned the land, but how the straight line interfered with the natural curve of the Earth's processes. Neighbors might dispute a fence line by mere inches, but those inches, when multiplied by a mile, and when multiplied again by the immutable force of water, could lead to ruin. The straight, uniform lines were designed to make surveying and selling easy, but they made farming, the actual use of the land, more difficult, and sometimes less sustainable. The settlers dependent on the clarity of the grid to own their property were slowly realizing they were trapped by its inflexibility. The Harrison family finished their log cabin on the high ground, near the center of their mile-square plot, and life began to settle into the predictable, four-square rhythm imposed by the forgotten law.
The grid was born of the Ohio Valley, a place of temperate rains and predictable fertility. When it marched westward across the 100th meridian and into the great American desert, its straight lines ceased to be a simple blueprint for civilization and became, instead, a fundamental act of violence against nature. The problem was simple. The Land Ordinance of 1785 was designed to measure area, but in the arid plains of the late 19th century, value was measured not in acres, but in water. The River Baron. In the territory of Wyoming, in 1892, Silas Vance, a man who believed implicitly in the geometry of the Republic, owned 9 meticulously surveyed sections of land. His ranch, the Vance Square, was a huge, perfect rectangle of 5,760 acres stretching across 3 townships. He had bought it sight unseen, relying on the numerical certainty of his deed. The land was flawless geometrically. It was wide, high prairie grass, but it was parched. The lifeblood of this region, the twisting, shallow North Fork River, cut a serpentine path 2 miles east of Silas's ranch. The river did not respect the grid. It flowed from the mountains, meandered where the topography decreed, and only crossed the corners of a half-dozen sections, those sections that happened to belong to a single man, the formidable cattle baron, Jedediah Pike. Pike understood the true flaw in the forgotten law. The grid guaranteed Silas a perfect, dry rectangle. The grid guaranteed Pike the riverfront, which meant he controlled the water source for miles around, regardless of the size or number of his deeds. Pike was a geographical monopolist. Silas rode to Pike's fortress-like homestead, crossing the invisible but absolute boundary of Pike's Section 34.
He found the river fenced, a 4-strand barbed wire barrier that ran straight along the arbitrary east-west line of the section. "Pike," Silas began, dismounting, "I need access to the water." Pike, a thick-set man with eyes like polished stones, leaned against the fence, a shotgun resting casually against his shoulder. "This is my northwest quarter, Vance, bought and paid for. The fence is on the surveyed line." "But the river runs through it," Silas protested. "I have 9 sections. I need to divert just a small stream, just enough to fill a cistern for my cattle." Pike spat on the ground near the fence post, a post that marked the exact corner of 4 sections. "The law gave you square land, Vance. It did not give you wet land. And out here, we don't follow the Eastern law of riparian rights, where the water belongs to all who border it. We follow prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. I was here first, and I bought the water." The conflict of 2 laws. This was the grid's great unseen failure in the West. It could not reconcile its abstract geometry with the doctrine of resource scarcity. The Land Ordinance of 1785 provided a framework for settlement, but it contained no provision for water rights. As a result, the arid states adopted local laws that prioritized use over location. The grid guaranteed that Section 12 and Section 34 were equal in area, but the water laws ensured they were vastly unequal in value. The straight section lines of the survey now served as absolute mathematical walls, holding the water hostage. Silas tried to negotiate, then he threatened to sue. His lawyer, based in the distant county seat, a town laid out in perfect 4-square grid itself, told him the brutal truth. "The grid made it easy to sell the land, Silas, but it made it impossible to share the water. The lines are true. The law is based on those lines. Pike's deeds are clear. He holds the entire frontage for a 2-mile stretch. He's not diverting the river. The river is diverting through his property. You have a legally perfect, geographically useless square of land." The line of desperation. The following spring, with the drought settling in like a fever, Silas Vance made a decision that broke the surveyor's sacred creed. He gathered his men, and under the cover of a moonless night, they rode east. They didn't try to cross Pike's fence. Instead, they began to dig. Using shovels and a team of mules, they started a ditch, not following the subtle natural contour of the land, but following the relentless, straight, 1-mile south line of Silas's own Section 10. They were digging a perfectly straight, man-made canal, parallel to the line of the grid, aimed to intercept the North Fork River at a point upstream before it reached Pike's territory. It was an act of defiance through geometry. If the law demanded straight lines, Silas would use a straight line to steal the resource the law had failed to protect. Pike found the new ditch the next morning. It ran ruler straight across the common corner where 4 townships met. He knew instantly what Silas was doing, using the very rigidity of the grid to circumvent the natural flow. The ensuing confrontation was not about the property line, it was about the failure of the property line. Pike's men waited with rifles at the ditch head. When Silas arrived, the air crackled with the understanding that the violence stemmed from the 1785 ordinance, which assumed all squares were created equal. Pike raised his rifle, aiming not at Silas, but at the ditch. "This is not how the water flows, Vance. You are breaking the land just to prove a point. I am following the law, Pike. I am following the law of geometry. You follow the river, I follow the straight line. The forgotten law had created a landscape of absolute clarity. The lines were indisputable, but in its clarity it had fostered an absolute irreconcilable scarcity, setting neighbor against neighbor and man against the vital curve of the continent. The grid, designed to bring order, was now a perfect geometry of chaos. The conflict over water rights in the grid's territory often ended in violence. The next chapter will jump forward to the mid-20th century to explore how the grid, now ubiquitous and forgotten, shaped the modern American mindset.
By the middle of the 20th century, the grid was complete. Its presence was so total, so absolute, that it had effectively become invisible. The American born in 1950 accepted the four-square layout of the roads, the mile-wide separation of the farms, and the checkerboard pattern of the map, not as the result of a deliberate radical law from 1785, but as the default setting of the world. The Land Ordinance had become the forgotten law because its success was too overwhelming. It had achieved cultural camouflage. The Geographer's Doubt. Anya Sharma, a cartographer and geographer working for the U.S. Geological Survey in the late 1960s, specialized in interpreting early satellite and high-altitude reconnaissance photographs. She was focused on mapping changes in agricultural land use across the Midwest. One crisp autumn morning, she stood before a wall of mosaic photos taken from a U-2 plane flying high above Kansas. She was tracing the boundaries of enormous irrigation circles, the modern geometric antithesis of the square section, when she took a step back. She wasn't looking at the circles, she was looking at the background. "It's not just farming," she murmured to her colleague. "It's a pattern." The lines were undeniable, even from miles above, cutting through the variegated tones of planted and fallow land. The mile-square sections and 6-mile townships were visible. It was a grid so immense, so unwavering, that it looked less like human settlement and more like a biological or geological phenomenon. "That's just how the land is, Anya," her colleague shrugged. "Roads, fences, we survey along the lines." But why the lines? Why are they so absolutely ruthlessly straight, mile after mile, state after state? Why do they ignore the topography? Look here in western Nebraska. The river curves violently, but the property lines, the roads, the fields, they all meet at perfect right angles. Anya, who grew up in the curving, organically developed land of the original 13 colonies, which had rejected the grid, realized she was seeing America not as a product of natural expansion, but as a colossal, centuries-old engineering project. The flaw of convergence. Her research led her back through the musty archives to the Land Ordinance of 1785. She devoured the journals of the first federal surveyors, reading the accounts of men like Elias Thorne wrestling their brass instruments through swamps and mountains. She soon discovered a necessary, fascinating flaw in the grid's perfection: the correction lines. The Earth is a sphere, but the grid assumes a flat plane. If surveyors started at the Ohio River and simply extended the north-south lines perfectly straight, those lines would converge toward the North Pole. By the time they reached Canada, the sections would be narrow triangles, not squares.
The law accounted for this with brilliant, almost obsessive precision. Every 24 miles, surveyors were required to stop, run an east-west correction line, and then reset their instruments, adjusting the alignment to create a new set of true north-south lines. Anya saw this geographical necessity as a profound symbol of the grid's dominance. The Earth was curved, but the American law demanded squares. Therefore, every 24 miles, the government had to insert a jog in the road, a visible, undeniable discontinuity in the otherwise flawless pattern, just to force the spherical Earth back into the legislative demands of the planar grid.
Anya took a small plane up over the Texas Panhandle and flew along a major east-west road she knew to be a correction line. She saw it then. Where the line began, the road visibly offset by several dozen feet before continuing straight. It was a tiny, human-made kink, the mathematical apology for imposing a flat map onto a curved world. "It's the scar," Anya wrote in her notebook, "the point where the human law admits the failure of geometry but refuses to surrender. The grid in the mind." Anya realized the grid's true power wasn't in land division, it was in the American mind. The grid instilled a faith in scale. If you can divide a continent into squares, you can manage anything. It created a people confident in large-scale projects and industrial agriculture. It created a distrust of the curve. Winding roads are inefficient, curving property lines are confusing. The grid prioritized speed and clarity over intimacy with the land. The grid became the default mental framework for millions. When a city planner in Phoenix or a farmer in Iowa looked at a blank space, the first image that sprang to mind was the right angle, the cross street, the four-square block. They were all descendants of the 1785 Ordinance, even if they had never heard its name. Anya published her findings in a small academic journal, arguing that the greatest single act of legislative landscaping in U.S. history had been rendered invisible by its very success. She concluded, the grid had not just shaped 75% of the country, it had given that country its uniformity, its relentless drive, and its specific, four-sided sense of destiny. But as Anya stared at the perfect, vast checkerboard, she knew that the land that was forced into squares would eventually long for the curve. The story is building toward a modern-day conflict where a community rebels against the rigidity of the grid. 240 years after the Land Ordinance established the rigid geometry of the nation, the grid was under siege, not by competing nations, but by a new environmental and cultural awareness. The mathematical efficiency that defined the 19th century was clashing violently with the sustainable values of the 21st. The struggle was playing out in a small valley in Idaho, a place the old surveyors had dubbed Township 12 North, Range 3 East. The curved corner. The trouble began with Willow Creek, a tributary that was historically vital for a population of endangered Chinook salmon. The creek flowed, as nature intended, in a series of oxbow bends and meanders, constantly shifting its banks, nourishing the riparian zone. In 2025, a massive development company, Gridstone Holdings, acquired sections 28, 29, 32, and 33. Their plan was straightforward: dredge and straighten the creek to minimize flood risk, sell the reclaimed floodplain, and build 4 identical, perfectly square subdivisions centered precisely on the section lines in homage to the grid's efficiency. Gridstone CEO Mark Tobin, a man who saw landscape as marketable property lines, scoffed at the historical context. "It's efficient," he told the local planning commission. "The property lines are clear. The square is the simplest form of ownership." Standing against him was a coalition of farmers and environmentalists led by Dr. Anya Sharma, the cartographer who, decades ago, saw the grid's scar from the air. She had spent her retirement fighting to reverse the damage caused by the forgotten law. Anya held a copy of an original 1805 survey map. "You are trying to impose a straight line on a fluid system. The creek must curve. It's the curvature that slows the water, creates the eddies for the salmon, and filters the nutrients. By straightening it, you destroy the ecology of the entire watershed, just to satisfy an old abstract law." "The old law is the only law," Tobin shot back. "My deed is clear. The property line is the south line of Section 29. The creek is on my land, and I can alter the flow within my boundaries."
She presented evidence to the court that certain small parcels along Willow Creek, held by a local ranching family, had never been sold under the 1785 ordinance. These were meets and bounds deeds, a system predating the grid, where property was defined by natural local landmarks. Beginning at the old basalt outcrop, following the center line of Willow Creek upstream, until the Great Oak, then running northeast to the fence line. The existence of these curved organic boundaries, defined by the natural flow of the creek rather than the arbitrary north-south line, proved that the grid was not the only legal reality. For the small sliver of land along the creek, the law of the curve still held precedence over the law of the square. Your Honor, Anya argued, the developer's proposed straight boundary, the mile-long section line, does not represent the reality of this landscape. The creek is the senior legal entity. The gridstone property lines are based on the abstract, forgotten law, which is fundamentally incompatible with a living river. The new topography. The court ruled in favor of the curve. The decision stipulated that while Gridstone owned the area defined by the sections, any development adjacent to Willow Creek must respect the creek's natural meander zone, even if that curve temporarily encroached upon the straight drawn line of the section. It was a small victory, but a profound shift. It was the legal recognition that the grid, the great forgotten law that shaped 75% of America, was an artificial construct, and that the Earth topography carried a higher, older set of laws. The court effectively declared that while the square was a brilliant tool for commodification, it was a terrible foundation for sustainability. In the end, the grid was not conquered, but acknowledged for what it was, a magnificent, flawed human invention. The square section lines still exist in millions of deeds and miles of fence posts, defining the roads, the fields, and the mindset of the American landscape. But in Idaho, on the banks of Willow Creek, a small patch of land was permanently curved. The message was clear. The legacy of 1785 was stability and efficiency. The future lay in understanding that for life to thrive, the line must sometimes bend. The grid that ate America was finally being forced to make room for the curve. Epilogue. The new topography. The grid's work is done. It paved the way for mass settlement and private land ownership, defining the American landscape and its enduring practical mindset. Its straight lines remain the bones of the West, visible from every high-flying plane, a monument to the tyranny of order. But today, the grid is more of a mental habit than an absolute mandate. Satellite imagery, which once merely confirmed the grid's dominance, now shows its consequences. The soil erosion following the straight-line plowing, the resource scarcity caused by geometrically perfect property boundaries, and the uniform urban sprawl it encourages. The challenge for the American future is learning to read two maps simultaneously. The old map of straight lines and abstract numbers imposed by the forgotten law, and the new map of curved contours and ecological flows dictated by the land itself. The grid will never vanish, but the necessity of the curve, the essential, natural geometry of the river and the ridge, is finally being remembered.